Harry Potter is likely one of the first mystery books you ever read. Some of you might not categorize it that way. You may say it's a coming-of-age novel or just another action-adventure, angsty teen self-insert story, but truly, it was a mystery. It's obvious now that we have 7 books, 8 movies, 3 spin-offs, and a weird play, but if you think back to the early 2000s, we didn't have any of the answers. Or at least, none of them were obvious. Within an author's toolkit, there's a variety of techniques used to reel in the reader. And among those tools is the technique of foreshadowing, giving readers a subtle hint of what's to come, many times without them even realizing a hint has been given. It's why when we go back and rewatch a Christopher Nolan movie like Interstellar, we pick up little clues that were initially meaningless, unraveling a mystery that seemed out of reach on the first pass, yet so obvious on the second. J.K. Rowling is no stranger to this technique, and the entire series is chock full of these hints. How many were initially completely intentional? We'll never know, but there's nothing like a small revelation of reading something and going, oh, it all makes so much sense now. So today, let's look at the biggest moments of foreshadowing in Harry Potter. Hopefully there's a few on here that will surprise even the most eagle-eyed fans out there. With that, here's the foreshadowing you missed in Harry Potter. Harry's Nightmare. On Harry's very first night at Hogwarts, we find him having a nightmare, one with very obvious implications. But we also need to remember that this book was literally written for children when it first came out, which might indicate a different purpose for that nightmare. While there are some obvious answers to the hints in his night terror, there's also some broader points worth mentioning. Perhaps Harry had eaten a bit too much because he had a very strange dream. He was wearing Professor Quirrell's turban, which kept talking to him, telling him that he must transfer to Slytherin at once because it was his destiny. Harry told the turban he didn't want to be in Slytherin. It got heavier and heavier. He tried to pull it off, but it tightened painfully. And there was Malfoy, laughing at him as he struggled with it. Then Malfoy turned into the hook-nosed teacher Snape, whose laugh became high and cold. There was a burst of green light, and Harry woke, sweating and shaking. He rolled over and fell asleep again, and when he woke next day, he didn't remember the dream at all. So we'll get to the obvious ones first. Harry's dream that he's wearing Professor Quirrell's turban, and the turban is talking to him. Spoiler alert, it's Voldemort. Quirrell is the bad guy, and Voldemort is on the back of his head, case closed, right? The more interesting part of this, though, is why is it telling Harry to move to Slytherin? And also, which part of Voldemort is actually talking to Harry here? First, the Slytherin bit. Quite honestly, I have to wonder how much of the plot had yet to be developed by J.K. Rowling. Again, children's book at this stage. Maybe this was just meant to be a scary moment for young readers diving into one of their first true novels. In the broader context of the Harry Potter series, it might just represent the connection between Harry and Voldemort. But I can't really think of any destiny to speak of related to Harry becoming a Slytherin. Maybe it's just Harry's internal struggle that's being highlighted here, and maybe there's no broader destiny, so to speak, because Voldemort's MO was never to get Harry to join him and rule the world together or something. Other parts of the dream also seem to point to this just being a red herring. Malfoy is just a schoolyard bully, and Snape is just meant to be a scary character to the reader at this point. We don't know his true intentions. Lastly, the dream terminates with a flash of green light, clearly an allusion to Avada Kedavra, and the final hint that Voldemort is obviously tied to all of this. The part that makes me wonder how much this dream is really supposed to connect to the rest of the story pivots around how Voldemort is interacting with Harry. Is it really just a dream and driven entirely by Harry's own anxiety, rather than a mental connection that we don't learn about until a few books later? Or is it Voldemort's actual soul? That would imply that J.K. Rowling knew about Voldemort and Harry being able to see into each other's minds from the very beginning. A piece of information that isn't revealed until several books later. Or was it instead an early version of that? Maybe she knew that there would be a connection between the two, but I'm not really sure where or when the idea of Horcruxes was truly solidified. Was it fully planned out in book 1, or was it developed over the first several books? If you take Path 1, she was foreshadowing events that wouldn't come to fruition until the end of the series. If you take Path 2, she kinda just threw a dart at the proverbial plot wall and ended up with something that could be justified later. If Horcruxes existed from the beginning of the story, the hardest part for me to explain is Voldemort's plan in Chamber of Secrets. Sure, maybe Lucius didn't know that the diary was a Horcrux when he gave it to Ginny, but if that's the case, why would Voldemort treat it so frivolously? Why not give it to Wormtail instead? This is a pretty central question to this entire video that you'll have to answer for yourself. How much did J.K. Rowling have this story planned out, and how much of it was developed along the way? Either way, we've got way too many moments of foreshadowing to get to, so let's move on to the next one. Snape the Mind Reader. This is a bit of an interesting piece of foreshadowing, but mainly because it seems to hint at two separate pieces of information. We join Harry in the Sorcerer's Stone just after he, Hermione, and Ron have uncovered the location of the stone hidden beneath Fluffy. Harry didn't know whether he was imagining it or not, but he seemed to keep running into Snape wherever he went. At times, he even wondered whether Snape was following him, trying to catch him on his own. Potions lessons were turning into a sort of weekly torture. Snape was so horrible to Harry. Could Snape possibly know they'd found out about the Sorcerer's Stone? Harry didn't see how he could, yet he sometimes had the horrible feeling that Snape could read minds. So, the two hints we have here. First, the mind reading. Again, this one is pretty straightforward after the fact. We know that Snape is an exceptionally accomplished practitioner of occlumency, having had to hide his thoughts from Voldemort for a long time. He was also accomplished at legilimency. Legilimency? Someone's gonna correct me on this one. Anyway, he taught Harry several books later how to control his mind and prevent Voldemort from intruding, but it's not something we learn about until the 5th book in the series. This is another one of those moments where it's hard to tell the extent of J.K. Rowling's planning. Dreams play a pretty significant role throughout most of the series, tying closely to fortune-telling and prophecies, but was it all planned out? Your guess is really as good as mine. The second thing this foreshadowed was Snape's ultimate role in the story as Harry's protector. We of course discover in the climax that Snape has been protecting Harry for the entire time, trying to stop Quirrell from murdering him the second he stepped onto campus. You'll recall that Snape was muttering the counter curse while Quirrell was trying to shake him off his broomstick, but Harry believes Snape is following him, and honestly, he probably is, just not for the reasons Harry suspects. Of course, he protects him from Quirrell and Philosopher's Stone, but it also sets up his series-long arc of guarding Harry all the way from book 1, long before we knew anything about his love for Lily Potter, or his loyalty to Dumbledore, or the ultimate sacrifice that he would end up making. Dumbledore's Triumph. One of the more rewarding things about making these videos is that this research is incredibly nostalgic. I'm sure that's the reason many of you are watching, but another reason is that there are so many details I just skimmed right over without a second thought back when I was in 3rd grade or whatever. And this really is the first one on the list where I was surprised to read it this time around, having the full context of the series. This one comes at the end of The Goblet of Fire. Harry's returned from the graveyard and is in Dumbledore's office, recounting his experiences and Voldemort's resurrection. This line in particular is while Harry tells Sirius Black and Dumbledore that Voldemort has taken his blood. "He said my blood would make him stronger than if he'd used someone else's," Harry told Dumbledore. "He said the protection my mother left in me, he'd have it too. And he was right. He could touch me without hurting himself. He touched my face. For a fleeting instant, Harry thought he saw a gleam of something like triumph in Dumbledore's eyes. But next second, Harry was sure he had imagined it. For when Dumbledore had returned to his seat behind the desk, he looked as old and weary as Harry had ever seen him. "Very well," he said, sitting down. "Voldemort has overcome that particular barrier. Harry, continue, please." So, am I wrong? This is a moment where the truth really is hiding out there in plain sight. For those that still don't understand the context, this snafu, this mistake, is what eventually brings about Voldemort's downfall, and is ultimately a small redeeming aspect for Dumbledore that doesn't make him a completely manipulative psychopath. When Voldemort takes Harry's blood, believing it to transfer Lily's protection and therefore negate the protection that Harry had, he's right. Kind of. What it actually did was tether Voldemort's life to Harry, meaning that neither could die while the other lived, hence the prophecy. Critically, this is what allows Harry to wander into the Forbidden Forest and take the direct hit of Avada Kedavra from Voldemort, and then wake back up moments later. Lily's protection stopped Harry from dying, and Voldemort's killing curse only succeeded in killing the piece of his soul that lived in Harry, that weird fetus-looking thing. Fast forward to the final battle, and with no Horcruxes remaining and a false belief in the Elder Wand, Voldemort's killing spell rebounds, killing him and ending the saga once and for all. At least until Harry Potter and the Cursed Child came out. Back to the moment at hand, though. Harry sees a gleam of something like triumph in Dumbledore's eyes. There's really only one explanation here, and it's that Dumbledore knew that Voldemort mixing his blood with Harry's would somehow tether their lives together. How exactly did he know that? Good question. And one that I'm sure no one really has an answer for. Sure, he might have had an educated guess based on what he knew about protection magic and the prophecy surrounding Harry, but it does still seem like a shot in the dark. Regardless, it's yet another example of foreshadowing which basically gave the whole story away 3 books before it ended. It's no wonder everyone was having conspiracy theories about Harry Potter before all the books came out. There's plenty of subject matter to talk about. Vanishing Cabinets. On to one of the most innocuous moments of foreshadowing in the entire series, the Vanishing Cabinets. If me saying the Vanishing Cabinets doesn't ring any bells, you're not alone. I had forgotten that this was even part of the story, much less teased several times before its introduction and conclusion. Recall in the Chamber of Secrets when Harry accidentally ends up in Borgin and Burke's after going the wrong way through the flue system, and he hides in a cabinet when he hears the Malfoys entering the shop. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside and pulled the doors, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. Malfoy and his dad talk with the shop owner for a while until Draco very nearly discovers Harry hiding in a nearby cabinet. Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward. He stretched out his hand for the handle. "Done," said Mr. Malfoy at the counter. "Come, Draco." Harry wiped his forehead on his sleeve as Draco turned away. At this point, there's quite literally no reason to think anything special about this cabinet. That is until we get a second clue only a few chapters later. Harry is moping around during a rainy day, and Filch finds him muddying up the castle. Harry is about to be written up when suddenly Filch is interrupted. But as Filch lowered his quill, there was a great bang on the ceiling of the office, which made the oil lamp rattle. "Peeves!" Filch roared, flinging down his quill in a transport of rage. "I'll have you this time! I'll have you!" Filch returns, muttering that the vanishing cabinet that Peeves dropped was quite valuable. Harry leaves the office moments later and sees the aftermath in the hallway. Nearly Headless Nick came gliding out of a classroom. Behind him, Harry could see the wreckage of a large black and gold cabinet, which appeared to have been dropped from a great height. "I persuaded Peeves to crash it right over Filch's office," said Nick eagerly. "Thought it might distract him." Notice it matches the description of the cabinet that Harry hid in pages earlier. Still, I don't think anyone would have connected them at this point. It's not until literally 3 books later in Order of the Phoenix where Fred and George shove Malfoy's fellow Slytherin Montague into that same Vanishing Cabinet from Book 2 that we even hear about it again. He never managed to get all the words out, said Fred, due to the fact that we forced him headfirst into that Vanishing Cabinet on the first floor. Hermione looked very shocked. But you'll get into terrible trouble. Not until Montague reappears, and that could take weeks. I don't know where we sent him, said Fred coolly. Anyway, we've decided we don't care about getting into trouble anymore. And then we fast forward again to Book 6, Half-Blood Prince, when Draco is leveling his wand at Dumbledore alongside his fellow Death Eaters. I had to mend that broken Vanishing Cabinet that no one's used for years, the one Montague got lost in last year. Ah, Dumbledore's sigh was a half-groan. He closed his eyes for a moment. That was clever. There is a pair, I take it. Inborgin and Burks, said Malfoy, and they make a kind of passageway between them. Montague told me that when he was stuck in the Hogwarts one, he was trapped in limbo, but sometimes he could hear what was going on at school, and sometimes what was going on in the shop, as if the cabinet was traveling between them. But he couldn't make anyone hear him. In the end, he managed to apparate out, even though he'd never passed his test. Nearly died doing it. Everyone thought it was a really good story, but I was the only one who realized what it meant. Even Borgin didn't know. I was the one who realized that there could be a way into Hogwarts through the cabinets if I fixed the broken one. Now, prior to this reveal, Harry has spent the better part of his year stalking Draco, trying to understand what he's up to. He follows him to Borgin and Burke's, where we can later piece together that Draco was asking about the cabinets. He tracks him on the Marauders map, seeing him often disappear into the Room of Requirement to work on the project. He even witnesses Draco vanish into the Room of Requirement while following him under the Cloak of Invisibility. All in all, this was a pretty surprising example for me of something that was teased all the way back in Book 2 and became the pivotal component of Draco's plan to kill Dumbledore in Book 6. You'll have to let me know in the comments if you knew about the through line of the Vanishing Cabinets, all the way from Chamber of Secrets to Half-Blood Prince, or is this one that was new to you as well? Also, while we're at it, we're about 17.5 minutes in. Feel free to subscribe if you're liking the content. If you made it this far, I'm guessing you kinda did, or you're hate watching it, one or the other. Anyway, click and subscribe, helps grow our channel, and helps me make more content like this for you. On to the next one. Ron the Foreshadower. Ron's role as the one who foreshadows events in the series could probably have an entire video just to itself. But for this entry, I'm just going to touch on several points where if you really paid attention, you might have caught a glimpse of events yet to unfold upon Harry and his friends. So, some quick hits. First off, there is Ron's entire divination plotline in The Prisoner of Azkaban. Not only does he predict that Harry will be in mortal danger, which is honestly not that hard of a thing to predict when we're talking about Harry Potter, he also predicts that he'll be stabbed in the back by a friend, which turns out to be Ron, on several occasions. But here's another fun one that's from the same scene. My turn, Ron peered into Harry's teacup, his forehead wrinkled with effort. There's a blob, a bit like a bowler hat, he said. Maybe you're gonna work for the Ministry of Magic. He turned the teacup the other way around. But this way it looks more like an acorn. What's that? He scanned his copy of Unfogging the Future. A windfall. Unexpected gold. I like this one because it's actually foreshadowing in two ways. Not only will Harry end up with a windfall of unexpected gold when he wins the Triwizard Tournament the following year, he also ends up working for the Ministry of Magic as an Auror when all is said and done. Moving on, there's a few more to cover here for Ron. In Chamber of Secrets, the trio is discussing the origins of both Tom Riddle's diary and Tom Riddle himself. Harry showed her T.M. Riddle's diary and told her the story of how they had found it. Oh, it might have hidden powers, said Hermione enthusiastically, taking the diary and looking at it closely. If it has, it's hiding them very well, said Ron. Maybe it's shy. I don't know why you don't chuck it, Harry. I wish I knew why someone did try to chuck it, said Harry. I wouldn't mind knowing how Riddle got an award for special services to Hogwarts either. Could have been anything, said Ron. Maybe he got 30 owls, or saved a teacher from the giant squid. Maybe he murdered Myrtle. That would have done everyone a favor. This, again, has two separate moments of foreshadowing. First, unrelated to Ron, Hermione predicts that the diary might have had hidden powers, which I think being a Horcrux qualifies as special powers. But second, Ron sarcastically predicts that Tom Riddle murdered Moaning Myrtle. Mind you, this is only about halfway through the book. No reveal has been made, and we're yet to discover the hidden truth behind both of these predictions. Tom did, in fact, murder Myrtle, and used that murder to create the magical Horcruxy powers that Hermione hints at. One final prediction, though there are many more, that comes to us in the final book, Deathly Hallows, where Ron, Harry, and Hermione are off on a Horcrux hunting adventure. Don't say the name. Ron cut across her, his voice harsh. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. I'm sorry, Ron said, moaning a little as he raised himself to look at them, but it feels like a jinx or something. Can't we call him you-know-who, please? Dumbledore said fear of a name, began Harry. In case you hadn't noticed, mate, calling you-know-who by his name didn't do Dumbledore much good in the end, Ron snapped back. Just show you-know-who some respect, will you? This prediction by Ron and his insistence in not using Voldemort's name ends up being completely justified just a few chapters later. The name's been jinxed, Harry. That's how they track people. Using his name breaks protective enchantments. It causes some kind of magical disturbance. It's how they found us in Tottenham Court Road. Because we used his name? Exactly. You've got to give him credit. It makes sense. It was only people who were serious about standing up to him, like Dumbledore, who ever dared use it. Now they've put a taboo on it. Anyone who says it is trackable. Quick and easy way to find Order members. So, that's really only 3 examples. I'm sure you can drop more in the comments. Ron basically functions as an expert foreshadower through the entire series. If you were to go back and reread every book, paying specific attention to Ron's dialogue, I'm fairly certain he'd give away the entire plot within his first few sentences. But you have to hand it to J.K. Rowling in this case. Each of these examples means essentially nothing on the first read-through. They're like throwaway lines that you skim over and don't really think twice about, only for them to come to fruition several chapters or several books later. Centaur Astrology. This is one of my favorites in the list, although I'll also say that it raises a weird discussion point when we talk about foreshadowing in a magical world. Does prophecy count as foreshadowing? I mean, I guess foreshadowing is supposed to be more subtle, so not obvious to the reader, whereas prophecy might be an exact prediction of what's to come. I don't know, you'll have to let me know. But anyways, back to the Centaurs. In Book 1, Philosopher's Stone, Hagrid has taken Draco, Harry, Neville, and Hermione out into the Forbidden Forest, along with his dog, Fang. They're in search of a wounded unicorn, whose blood the Quirrell Voldemort abomination has been using to maintain their life while they search for the Philosopher's Stone. Along the way, the group runs into the native centaurs a few times, and on each occasion, they cryptically discuss how bright the planet Mars is. Here's one such occasion. Well enough. Look, I just been asking Ronan, you seen anything odd in here lately? There's a unicorn been injured. Would you know anything about it? Bane walked over to stand next to Ronan. He looked skyward. Mars is bright tonight, he said simply. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was an 8-year-old reading this book, there's just no way I would have understood this part of the conversation. As an adult, you might make the connection between the planet Mars and the Roman god of war, but short of recognizing that, this conversation feels so completely out of place, as though the centaurs are ignoring Hagrid and just making random astrology small talk. Though the dots might start to connect after Friends rescues Harry and has a conversation with his fellow centaurs a few pages later. What have you been telling him? Growled Bane. Remember, friends, we are sworn not to set ourselves against the heavens. Have we not read what is to come in the movements of the planets? So again, does prophecy count as foreshadowing? The Centaurs have either predicted Harry's battle with Voldemort over the coming school year, or more broadly, the return of Voldemort into his own body in the Great Wizarding War that will unfold over the coming 7 years. You be the judge of that. But the question still stands. Is that foreshadowing, or is that just a moment of, yeah, of course, there's 7 more books to come, like, of course there's gonna be more conflict? I don't know. You be the judge. Hagrid's Horcrux. The Centaur prophecy actually stirred another question in my mind. What if Hagrid was the first one to uncover the existence of Voldemort's Horcruxes? While talking to the Centaurs about the purpose of unicorn blood, Harry recalls an early conversation with Hagrid, which happens all the way back in Chapter 4, not too long after Harry meets Hagrid for the very first time. He asks Hagrid all kinds of questions until he gets to this one. But what happened to you know who? Good question, Harry. Disappeared. Vanished. Same night he tried to kill you. Makes you even more famous. That's the biggest mystery, see? He was getting more and more powerful. Why'd he go? Some say he died. Codswallop, in my opinion. Don't know if he had enough human left in him to die. I had to read that quote like 7 times. It's so hard to read Hagrid's speech. Anyways, maybe I'm reading into this a little too closely, but that's literally the purpose of these videos. Hagrid claims that maybe Voldemort didn't have enough human left in him to die, an obvious allusion to the process of creating Horcruxes, which splits the soul of the user each time. But would Hagrid have known about the existence of Horcruxes? I don't think most witches or wizards in the Harry Potter universe would have even known about their existence. As far as we know, only 2 people have ever successfully created a Horcrux. First, Herpo the Foul, an ancient dark wizard, and Voldemort. That's it. So would Hagrid really be aware of them? Not to mention, Voldemort doesn't truly confirm his suspicion until after the events with the diary in the 2nd book. So all signs seem to point towards no. Hagrid wouldn't know about this, but it could have been a clever little indication from J.K. Rowling about the eventual mechanism behind Voldemort's immortality. Or maybe I'm reading way too deeply into this. You tell me. Room of Urgent Requirements. Despite being just one small room in Hogwarts, the Room of Requirements is critical to many different parts of the series, from hiding Horcruxes to hosting Dumbledore's army, and yet we don't actually see it until the 5th book, The Order of the Phoenix. Or do we? While Dumbledore's army doesn't start training there until book 5, one book earlier in Goblet of Fire, we have a small throwaway line from Dumbledore himself that doesn't seem to serve much of a purpose besides teasing the existence of the Room of Requirements. Dumbledore is chatting with Durmstrang headmaster Igor Karkaroff, who is bragging about knowing all the secrets of his own school. Dumbledore replies, "Oh, I would never dream of assuming I know all Hogwarts secrets, Igor," said Dumbledore amicably. "Only this morning, for instance, I took a wrong turn on the way to the bathroom and found myself in a beautifully proportioned room that I had never seen before, containing a really rather magnificent collection of chamber pots. When I went back to investigate more closely, I discovered that the room had vanished, but I must keep an eye out for it. Possibly it's only accessible at 5:30 in the morning, or it may only appear at the quarter moon, or when the seeker has an exceptionally full bladder." What a strange line that has absolutely no meaning unless you understand it to be an early reference to the Room of Requirements, something that would have been impossible to imagine up before it was introduced in Book 5. It's the kind of foreshadowing that makes me question whether or not certain elements were planned out. Sure, J.K. Rowling had the skeleton of the series mapped out. She may have even had the concept of Horcruxes and the climactic battle planned from the beginning. But was the Room of Requirements there from the start? Or was it added after the fact? The consequences reach a little further than you might initially believe. J.K. Rowling has early notes referencing both the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's army, which initially had their names switched. I've got a whole video about those hidden changes if you want to see more. But regardless, Harry's band of student warriors, whatever you call them, would have had to have a secret place to practice. And if there was no room of requirements in the castle, it does leave you to wonder about where else they might have practiced. Keep in mind, it would have had to stand up to the constant probing by Umbridge, so it really limits the possibilities. The best ideas that come to me are either somewhere deep in the Forbidden Forest, which seems problematic for a number of reasons, the least of which being discovered by Umbridge and crew. Really, the only other suggestion I have is the Shrieking Shack, but it's hard to really know if that would have been enough room or soundproof enough to guard their secret. I have a feeling 30-odd students sneaking off into the Forbidden Forest or to the Shrieking Shack would have been pretty noticeable. Meanwhile, while writing Goblet of Fire, J.K. Rowling knew that in the next book, Dumbledore's army would have needed a place to practice. And knowing that, she laid the groundwork for the Room of Requirement, which eventually grew into so much more than Dumbledore's emergency porta-potty. Petunia's Enemy. Up next, some foreshadowing that comes up in Book 5 and then is promptly forgotten all the way until Book 7. Order of the Phoenix starts off with Harry and Dudley being attacked by Dementors. It's also where J.K. Rowling dropped a famous red herring that might have been more of an accident than anything. The infamous Mark Evans, a throwaway character that fans latched onto primarily because Lily Potter's maiden name was also Evans. It turned out to be a big misunderstanding, but if you're interested, I've got an entire video on fan theories and misconceptions that you can check out. Anyways, Harry and Dudley get attacked, Dudley almost dies, and Harry is then forced to explain Dementors to Uncle Vernon. But instead of Harry doing the explaining, it's actually Aunt Petunia that surprisingly takes on the task. "How many times do I have to tell you," said Harry, temper and voice rising together. "It wasn't me. It was a couple of Dementors. A couple of... what's this codswallop?" "Dementors," said Harry slowly and clearly. "Two of them. And what the ruddy hell are Dementors?" "They guard the wizard prison Azkaban," said Aunt Petunia. 2 seconds ringing silence followed these words, and then Aunt Petunia clapped her hand over her mouth as though she had let slip a disgusting swear word. Uncle Vernon was goggling at her. Harry's brain reeled. Mrs. Figg was one thing, but Aunt Petunia? "How'd you know that?" he asked her, astonished. Aunt Petunia looked quite appalled with herself. She glanced at Uncle Vernon in fearful apology, and then lowered her hand slightly to reveal her horsey teeth. "I heard that awful boy telling her about them years ago," she said jerkily. "If you mean my mom and dad, why don't you just use their names?" said Harry loudly, but Aunt Petunia ignored him. She seemed horribly flustered. Now, the point to note here is Petunia is talking about that awful boy. Harry incorrectly assumes that she's talking about his father, but instead, Petunia is actually foreshadowing the entire finale of Snape's character arc, because it's not James that Petunia hates, it's Severus Snape. But there's really no way for readers to know that in Book 5. There's no reason to expect at this point that Snape is really even all that connected to Lily. It's not until we pick things back up in Book 7, The Deathly Hallows, directly after Snape is killed, that we return to this scene. Harry returns to Dumbledore's office and pours Snape's memories into the Pensieve to review, and within them, he discovers the infatuation that rules Snape's life. But he also finds one little callback to that scene in the Order of the Phoenix. Lily is talking to Snape as this scene begins. "Tell me about the Dementors again. What do you want to know about them for? If I use magic outside school, they wouldn't give you to the Dementors for that. Dementors are for people that do really bad stuff. They guard the wizard prison Azkaban. You're not gonna end up in Azkaban. You're too..." He turned red again and shredded more leaves. Then a small rustling noise behind Harry made him turn. Petunia, hiding behind a tree, had lost her footing. "They guard the wizard prison Azkaban." It's the exact wording used by Petunia 2 books earlier, which means that the boy Petunia mentioned hating is not James Potter, but Severus Snape. The hate is probably driven in part by the obsession that Snape has with her sister, among other factors, but that obsession was revealed 2 books earlier with no one being the wiser. Gilderoy Lockhart. A little bit of a palate cleanser. Just a short little moment that probably went right past you unless you were really paying very, very close attention. Early on in the Chamber of Secrets, our trio, along with their parents, even Hermione's parents, are purchasing school supplies for the year and wandering around the shops. Honestly, I had completely forgotten that Hermione's parents were present in any way in the early books. I'm not sure if they appear much after this, but they briefly interact with Mr. Weasley as he talks to them about Muggle things. So, all of our characters make their way to a book signing for one Gilderoy Lockhart, who you will recall becomes the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher in their second year. Here is the description upon meeting Lockhart for the very first time. See if you can catch the hint. Gilderoy Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazzling white teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forget-me-not blue, which exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard's hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. Did you catch it? The color of his robes and his eyes? Forget-me-not blue. That's it. There really isn't much more to this. Of course, Lockhart will obliviate himself just before the climactic battle with the Basilisk, so this one is a small nod to his eventual fate that I'm sure most people never even noticed. On to the next one. Lupin's Secret. Another fun one that doesn't really have far-reaching consequences but is still interesting when you learn is yet another instance of J.K. Rowling giving away the game just a few chapters into the book. Harry rushes into Defense Against the Dark Arts a few minutes late, only to discover the class is not being taught by his normal third-year professor, Lupin. Instead, Snape is filling in. You are easily satisfied. Lupin is hardly overtaxing you. I would expect first years to be able to deal with redcaps and grindylows. Today, we shall discuss. Harry watched him flick through the textbook to the very back chapter, which he must know they hadn't covered. Werewolves, said Snape. But sir, said Hermione, seemingly unable to restrain herself, we're not supposed to do werewolves yet. We're just due to start hinky-punks. Miss Granger, said Snape in a voice of deadly calm, I was under the impression that I am teaching this lesson, not you, and I am telling you all to turn to page 394. He glanced around again. All of you, now. Now, is it a responsible thing for a professor like Snape to so openly hint towards the true reason behind Lupin's absence? Probably not. Besides, his name is Lupin, so he might as well be called Professor Werewolf. But then there is also the oddly specific direction from Snape to turn to page 394, and you'll never guess what you find there. Nothing. Prisoner of Azkaban is only 368 pages long, but actually, if you turn to page 394 in Deathly Hallows, no, still nothing. It seems like it was just an arbitrary page number that Snape mentioned. No deeper secrets or foreshadowing with that one. But back to Lupin. Snape's hints are far from the only ones pointing towards lycanthropy, but there's one interesting one that you'll probably be misremembering. If you watched the movies, you'll recall that early on, Lupin is instructing the third years on how to fight a boggart. And in the movies, as soon as it's Harry's turn, a Dementor begins to form. Lunging towards him, Lupin jumps in front, grabbing the focus of the boggart as it turns into the reveal of a full moon. I mean, it doesn't really get any more obvious than that, does it? Only, this never actually happens in the books. Harry never even makes it to the front of the line of students. Lupin ends practice before he gets a chance, later defending his actions to Harry. "Why didn't you let me fight it?" said Harry abruptly. Lupin raised his eyebrows. "I would have thought that was obvious, Harry," he said, sounding surprised. Harry, who had expected Lupin to deny that he'd done any such thing, was taken aback. "Why?" he said again. "Well," said Lupin, frowning slightly, "I assumed that if the boggart faced you, it would assume the shape of Lord Voldemort." The one thing this leaves me questioning, just like I'm sure many of you are, is what would have happened if the boggart had turned into Voldemort? How powerful are boggarts compared to the real thing that they're imitating? It's somewhere on the scale of completely powerless to a 1-to-1 match of the original. So where would a copy of Voldemort have fallen? I'm guessing it wouldn't have had a real wand, so I doubt it would have just started Avada Kedavering students left and right, but I also don't think it would have been completely harmless. Maybe that's a topic for another video. Snape the Good Guy. Okay, I know this is a central plot twist to the entire series, and we all know it at this point, but you have to think back and remember that we didn't know Snape's true motives until late in the series. Borders, that old bookstore, even put on events around this mystery, which they called the Great Snape Debate. They emailed customers and had a series of events in stores centered around guessing Snape's true alignment, and whether he was a friend or foe of Harry. So, while it might be obvious in hindsight, readers really didn't have a concrete answer back in 2007. That is, unless they paid attention to some very subtle clues along the way. At the end of Goblet of Fire, Harry has been abducted by a fake Mad-Eye Moody, though he still believes him to be the original. Harry is taken to Moody's office where he's eventually saved, but within Moody's office there is an object that gives us a small hint about Snape's alignment: the foe glass. An object that is supposed to show the owner when his foes are near. The foes in question becoming more clear in a mirror the closer they get. Throughout the book, the figures in the mirror have been blurry, leaving the reader none the wiser. But as the climax draws to a conclusion, things begin to change. The foggy shapes in the faux glass were sharpening, had become more distinct. Harry could see the outlines of 3 people over Moody's shoulder, moving closer and closer, but Moody wasn't watching them. His magical eye was upon Harry. Dumbledore barges in, stupefying Moody, and the faux glass immediately undergoes a shift. Harry, still staring at the place where Moody's face had been, saw Albus Dumbledore, Professor Snape, and Professor McGonagall looking back at him out of the faux glass. He looked around and saw the 3 of them standing in the doorway, Dumbledore in front, his wand outstretched. Notice the obvious characters in the mirror, Dumbledore and McGonagall, but the faux glass also includes Snape, indicating that he is an enemy of Barty Crouch Jr., and by extension, Voldemort. The only thing we don't know about the faux glass is if it can be tricked. Could strong emotions conjured up in the moment be enough to fool the faux glass into showing a false enemy? If Snape was actually to be on Voldemort's side, that would have required him to know about the faux glass and proactively prepare a way to trick it, which obviously never happens, and it seems far-fetched to begin with, leaving us with the answer to is Snape good or evil all the way back in Book 4. Imposter Moody. While I was rereading that introduction to Mad-Eye Moody above for the previous one, there was actually another piece of foreshadowing that I noticed in the moment. It's another one that fits in the, oh, that's incredibly obvious in hindsight category. So, Harry is coming into Mad-Eye Moody's room, or rather, Imposter Mad-Eye's office for the first time, and upon entering, he sees the shelves lined with all sorts of strange instruments and magical tools. On his desk stood what looked like a large, cracked glass spinning top. Harry recognized it at once as a sneakoscope, because he owned one himself, though it was much smaller than Moody's. In the corner, on a small table, stood an object that looked something like an extra squiggly golden television aerial. It was humming slightly. What appeared to be a mirror hung opposite Harry on the wall, but it was not reflecting the room. Shadowy figures were moving around inside it, none of them clearly in focus. "Like my dark detectors, do you?" said Moody, who was watching Harry closely. "What's that?" Harry asked, pointing at the squiggly golden aerial. "Secrecy sensor. Vibrates when it detects concealment and lies. No use here, of course, too much interference. Students in every direction lying about why they haven't done their homework. Been humming ever since I got here. I had to disable my sneakoscope because it wouldn't stop whistling. It's extra sensitive, picks up stuff about a mile around. Of course, it could be picking up more than kid stuff, he added in a growl. But couple things. For starters, the sneakoscope is a magical device that would spin up and whistle if anyone was doing anything untrustworthy around it. Now, obviously, Imposter Barty Crouch Jr. had to break the top to stop it from constantly spinning while he was around it, hence why when Harry sees it, it's cracked and non-functional. I mean, duh. Second, the secrecy sensor is humming. Fake Moody comes right out and says that it vibrates when it detects concealment and lies. He tries to cover it up, but I'm really left wondering why he wouldn't have broken that one as well, just as he did the sneakoscope. And lastly, of course, we have the faux glass that I just talked about, but that isn't revealed until the very end. Honestly, after rereading the description of the sneakoscope and the secrecy sensor, I'm wondering how I didn't pick up those things on my first read. They seem so obvious now. You'll have to let me know in the comments how many of these moments of foreshadowing you picked up on and how many did you completely overlook. Sirius Fate. There are not many deaths that hit as hard in the Harry Potter series as Sirius Black. I remember vividly feeling as though Harry had finally found family, someone he could relate to as a parental figure, only to have that taken away just a few books later in the Order of the Phoenix. And that death came as a complete and utter shock. That is, unless J.K. Rowling placed the tiniest of hints within the first few chapters of the book. Harry is just arriving at number 12 Grimmauld Place for the first time, accompanied by Moody and a few other members of the Order. After Mad-Eye brings Harry into the house, Harry has a thought that many would consider a throwaway line. That is, this would be a throwaway line if it was any other video about the topic, but we're talking about the most benign of hints here. So, the others' hushed voices were giving Harry an odd feeling of foreboding. It was as though they had entered the house of a dying person. Number 12 Grimmauld Place is obviously the family home of Sirius Black, and plain as day, Harry calls it the house of a dying person. Now, without going too deep into the fan theory side of things, it does beg the question of fate. Was Sirius destined to die? Was falling through the veil what killed him, or was it Bellatrix Lestrange? Did it just happen to coincide? And was all of this predicted by Harry's gut feeling on page 60? 800 pages before it actually happens? You tell me. This one feels like it's maybe a bit of a stretch, but you really can't disregard any of these. Scabbers Surprise. Okay, basically every time I start reading about one moment of foreshadowing, at this point I find another. Yet again, we have another entry involving a sneakoscope, a device that gave away Barty Crouch just a couple entries ago. This time it involves Scabbers and his secret wormtail identity. This is around Christmas time in their third year. Harry, Ron, and Hermione are chopping it up, relaxing in the Gryffindor Commons, when Crookshanks, Hermione's cat, lunges at Ron. Ron bellowed as Crookshanks' claws ripped his pajamas and Scabbers attempted a wild escape over his shoulder. Ron seized Scabbers by the tail and aimed a misjudged kick at Crookshanks that hit the trunk at the end of Harry's bed, knocking it over and causing Ron to hop up and down, howling with pain. Crookshanks' fur suddenly stood on end. A shrill, tint whistling was filling the room. The pocket sneakoscope had become dislodged from Uncle Vernon's old socks and was whirling and gleaming on the floor. I forgot about that, Harry said, bending down and picking up the sneakoscope. I never wear these socks if I can help it. The sneakoscope whirled and whistled in his palm. Crookshanks was hissing and spitting at it. I mean, by my count, the sneakoscope has actually already given away Scabbers / Peter Pettigrew twice by this point. First, when Ron sends it to Harry as a gift on his birthday back on, page 8. Harry, this is a pocket sneakoscope. If there's someone untrustworthy around, it's supposed to light up and spin. Bill says it's rubbish, sold for wizard tourists, and isn't reliable, because it keeps lighting up at dinner last night. But he didn't realize Fred and George had put beetles in his soup. It might have been buzzing because of Fred and George, but in reality, it was probably Scabbers. And then just a few chapters later, on the train into Hogwarts, it starts buzzing when the three of them are just sitting in the train car, Scabbers curled up on Ron's chest. Honestly, at this point, I'm just realizing how poor my reading comprehension was as a 10-year-old. Come on, I can't be the only one finding out about these for the first time. Dinner for 13. This has to be one of the more subtle hints and moments of foreshadowing on the list. Honestly, I don't know how anyone would have connected the dots even after finishing the book, so strap in for this one. I wasn't kidding when I said that every time I look for one moment of foreshadowing, I find another. This is literally pages after Crookshanks attacks Scabbers, and the sneakoscope hints at his deceit. That might be the only way readers would have connected this next bit of foreshadowing. Directly after that scene, the trio head down to the Great Hall for lunch. At lunchtime, they went down to the Great Hall to find that the house tables had been moved against the walls again, and that a single table, set for 12, stood in the middle of the room. Professors Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, Sprout, and Flitwick were there, along with Filch, the caretaker, who had taken off his usual brown coat and was wearing a very old and rather moldy-looking tailcoat. There were only 3 other students, 2 extremely nervous-looking first-years, and a sullen-faced Slytherin 5th year. So if you count all of those up, that is 9 people, and then Harry, Ron, and Hermione come and sit down, making 12. Trelawney comes in after that. "Sybil, this is a pleasant surprise," said Dumbledore, standing up. Dumbledore talks to her for a moment, and then he summons a chair for her, but Trelawney at first refuses. And he did indeed draw a chair in midair with his wand, which revolved for a few seconds before falling with a thud between Professors Snape and McGonagall. Professor Trelawney, however, did not sit down. Her enormous eyes had been roving around the table, and she suddenly uttered a kind of soft scream. "I dare not, Headmaster. If I join the table, we shall be 13. Nothing could be more unlucky. Never forget that when 13 dine together, the first one to rise will be the first to die." Now comes the nail in the coffin. Just a few pages earlier, Harry makes a comment that it's been a while since he's seen Scabbers out of Ron's pocket, implying that Ron always keeps the rat with him. With the knowledge that Scabbers is in fact Peter Pettigrew, something that we don't know yet in this book, when we recount the number of people at the Christmas feast table, we find that when Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat down, they didn't add 3 to the total, they added 4. Meaning that when Trelawney walked in and Dumbledore stood up, there were already 13 people dining together. As luck would have it, Dumbledore was the first to rise, and the first to die. It only took 3 more books for it to happen. So, I thought the last one was a stretch, but this one seems even more so. At the same time though, why else would J.K. Rowling write that line if not to hint towards some greater plot twist? Dumbledore's Ring. Critical to the entire plot of Harry Potter are the Horcruxes. They are the primary mechanism through which Voldemort's plans are and will be accomplished. However, funny enough, we don't truly understand them for what they are until most of the way through Book 6. Before that point, Harry has stumbled across a couple, like Tom Riddle's diary, but there's another hiding in plain sight. Harry has several encounters with Dumbledore early on in the Half-Blood Prince. Each time he asks him what has happened to Dumbledore's hand, and each time, Dumbledore shrugs him off, not explaining the curse that has taken him over. They also pay a visit to Slughorn, where Harry notices for the first time a ring that Dumbledore has taken to wearing. "You're not yet as old as I am, Horace," said Dumbledore. "Well, maybe you ought to think about retirement yourself," said Slughorn bluntly. His pale gooseberry eyes had found Dumbledore's injured hand. "Reactions not what they were, I see." "You're quite right," said Dumbledore serenely, shaking back his sleeve to reveal the tips of those burned and blackened fingers. The sight of them made the back of Harry's neck prickle unpleasantly. "I am undoubtedly slower than I was, but on the other hand," he shrugged and spread his hands wide as though to say that age had its compensations, and Harry noticed a ring on his uninjured hand that he had never seen Dumbledore wear before. It was rather large, rather clumsy, and made of what looked like gold, and was set with a heavy black stone that was cracked down the middle. Slughorn's eye lingered for a moment on the ring too, and Harry saw a tiny frown momentarily crease his wide forehead. Now, at this point, there's no possible way for the reader to connect any of this to Marvolo Gaunt's ring, not through Harry calling it out, nor because of Slughorn's reaction. It's not until Harry and Dumbledore are exploring the memories of a former Ministry of Magic employee that they see it on Marvolo Gaunt's hand. Several pages later, Harry recognizes it sitting on Dumbledore's table. But isn't it the same ring Marvolo Gaunt showed Ogden? Dumbledore bowed his head. The very same. But how come... Have you always had it? No, I acquired it very recently, said Dumbledore. A few days before I came to fetch you from your aunt and uncle's house, in fact. That would be around the time you injured your hand then, sir. Around that time, yes, Harry. Harry hesitated. Dumbledore was smiling. Sir, how exactly... Too late, Harry. You shall hear the story another time. Good night. At this point, J.K. Rowling is practically begging the reader to realize that the ring is responsible for the damage to Dumbledore's hand, and Dumbledore eventually reveals the truth to Harry some 13 chapters later when he explains Horcruxes. So, I guess this one is a bit questionable. There was obviously foreshadowing surrounding the ring, and the idea that it had some importance, but does that count as foreshadowing if there's no way for the reader to guess the truth? Another question I have after all of this is, what would have happened if Harry was dead and Voldemort needed to return again like he did in Goblet of Fire? He had to perform the ritual with his dad's bones, the flesh of a servant, and the blood of the enemy. Was that a mythical capital E enemy that only Harry Potter could satisfy? Or could it have been anyone who didn't like Voldemort? It's very poetic and thematic that Harry's blood was used, but could it have just been any other random Auror that could do the job? And lastly, while I'm at it, where does Wormtail get the weird baby version of Voldemort in Goblet of Fire? I've cited this 2007 quote from J.K. Rowling a few times, but here goes again. There are two things that I think are too horrible, actually, to go into detail about. One of them is how Pettigrew brought Voldemort back into a rudimentary body, because I told my editor what I thought happened there, and she looked as though she was going to vomit. And then the other thing is how you make a Horcrux. At the risk of demonetizing my channel, the running theory out there is it has to do with Wormtail stealing a baby and using it to bring back Voldemort. You can connect the dots or Google it or whatever. I know we took a bit of a departure there, but sometimes I have questions, and the easiest way to get answers sometimes is just to say them out loud and then wait for angry comments to come in and light me up. So, whatever, do your worst. Horcrux Self-Defense. We're getting to the last few, but this is one of my favorites. It's a moment in the first chapter of The Order of the Phoenix, where essentially the central mystery of the series is spoiled by Uncle Vernon. Harry is milling about, waiting for summer to end, waiting to return to Hogwarts and his friends, when he and the Dursleys are startled by a loud noise. Some chaos ensues, and Vernon ends up strangling Harry. Harry had barely staggered upright again when two large purple hands reached through the open window and closed tightly around his throat. For a few seconds, they struggled, Harry pulling at his uncle's sausage-like fingers with his left hand, his right maintaining a firm grip on his raised wand. Then, just as the pain in the top of Harry's head gave a particularly nasty throb, Uncle Vernon yelped and released Harry as though he had received an electric shock. Some invisible force seemed to have surged through his nephew, making him impossible to hold. The hard part about writing these scripts is that I'm trying to think back to what I thought in the moment. Did I, like many readers I would guess, just kind of glaze over this part about an electric shock? Did I just assume that the invisible force was just sort of some mental spell that Harry had subconsciously cast on Vernon? Probably. I don't think I would have given it much thought. It happens on page 5, after all. The conclusion I definitely would not have drawn was that Harry had a portion of Voldemort's soul inside of him, and that portion was defending itself when it shocked Vernon Dursley. You have to remember, it's obvious in hindsight that Harry was a Horcrux, but when Order of the Phoenix came out in 2003, no one had any clue how everything would end, and you would have been hard-pressed to find someone that had it all figured out before reading Half-Blood Prince. I am curious, though. You'll have to mention in the comments when you began to piece the mystery together. Did it take you until the final pages of Deathly Hallows, or were you able to predict the direction before the end? Now, you may have realized that part of Voldemort's soul was inside of Harry at some point, but I don't know that you would have drawn the conclusion that he was a Horcrux until we knew about the word Horcrux at the end of Book 6. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Let me know. The Not So Deathly Hallows. I've saved what is probably one of the more far-fetched theories for last, so strap in. Even though the whole story revolves around Harry and Voldemort's soul and their connection, the Deathly Hallows somehow become both incredibly important and insignificant at the same time. This is another moment where we don't learn about what the Hallows are until the final book. But what if there were some insanely subtle hints along the way that pointed to Harry's eventual ownership of all three? And what if all three were actually foreshadowed as Christmas gifts from the Dursleys? I know, this is probably completely grasping at straws, but bear with me. We'll go in chronological order, starting first with the Resurrection Stone. It's Harry's first Christmas at Hogwarts, and among other presents, he gets one gift from the Dursleys. A second very small parcel contained a note. "We've received your message and enclose your Christmas present," from Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia. Taped to the note was a 50-pence piece. Potentially nothing, but just hold it in your mind for a moment as we move on to the second gift, one book later in the Chamber of Secrets. At that moment, Hedwig swooped into the room, carrying a very small package in her beak. "Hello," said Harry happily as she landed on his bed. "Are you speaking to me again?" She nibbled his ear in an affectionate sort of way, which was a far better present than the one that she had brought him, which turned out to be from the Dursleys. They had sent Harry a toothpick and a note telling him to find out whether he'd be able to stay at Hogwarts for the summer holidays too. Okay, 2 for 2. A toothpick sure does look an awful lot like a really tiny magical wand, right? Okay, let's bring it home. A couple books later in the Goblet of Fire, Harry again gets a completely innocuous gift from the Dursleys. Harry's other presents were much more satisfactory than Dobby's odd socks, with the obvious exception of the Dursleys, which consisted of a single tissue, an all-time low. We've made it this far. I mean, a tissue is pretty obviously a stand-in for the cloak of invisibility, right? The strange thing is, you might think that I'm cherry-picking his Christmas gifts here, but these are actually the only Christmas gifts from the Dursleys that are mentioned. In years 3, 5, 6, and 7, Harry does not receive any gifts from his Muggle relatives. And if we've learned anything in this video, it's that you can't overlook anything in the Harry Potter books, not even the completely meaningless Christmas presents. Now, the question that comes out of all of this is, what is the point? Why does it matter that the Deathly Hallows are hinted at? And honestly, I don't really have a great answer. The best I can come up with is that it shows early on that Harry will eventually be the owner of all three Hallows, but I really can't think of any other connection. Maybe this one is really just grasping at straws, or maybe you all have some better ideas. Let me know in the comments. So, after more than an hour of these moments of foreshadowing, did anything surprise you? I have to be honest, there were a bunch on this list that went right over my head on my first reading. That, in combination with the movies coming out at the same time as the books, really blurs your memories together, or at least it blurs mine. Which part did I read in the book? Which scene am I remembering from a movie? I don't know, they all mix together. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, click that subscribe button and the bell. There's also plenty more where this came from if you're interested in Harry Potter lore. I've got a bunch of other videos on other fiction series as well. Go check them out. And if you've got other ideas for more of these deep dives, let me know. I'm always looking for suggestions. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.